The battle is raging in every direction, and the young warrior is at the very center of it. To his right, massive war elephants crash into his army, trumpeting so loud his ears ring. To his left, an elite force of armored cavalry swoop in to cut down foot soldiers, their horses trampling the corpses of his fallen comrades. And right in front of him, a heaving sea of steel and flesh and blood, as men slice and pierce into each other with spears and swords and axes. Suddenly, there's a gap in the enemy's ranks, a momentary weakness that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Now's his chance. Strike the enemy in its weak spot and give his king's army a way forward. But his body tenses with fear. If he charges now, enemies might surround him from the left and right, leaving him no escape. There's a very real possibility that he might not survive. But on the other hand, if he hesitates now and his soldiers, or God forbid the king, see him turn back, his life is finished. He'll lose his titles, be thrown out of the kingdom, and perhaps worst of all, his own mother would never look at his face again. Far better to choose death and glory over a life of shame. The warrior commands his trumpeter to blow the signal to his troops. They assemble under his banner, and with a great war cry, he drives his horse forward into the gap. His soldiers follow, yelling at the top of their lungs as they pierce the enemy like a lance, breaking apart the tight formation and scattering the enemy in all directions. Both armies tear into each other, with no armor to protect their bodies from raw steel. But amidst the chaos, none of the soldiers notice that their young commander is nowhere to be seen. Just the screams of a horse being hacked to pieces. It's only the next day, as a handful of soldiers pick through the mass of bodies, that they find the warrior face down in the blood-soaked mud, the broken tip of a spear lodged in his chest, his sword still by his side. This is the history of warfare in medieval India, not as the movies or epic stories show it, but as the very honest, very brutal reality of doing battle 1,000 years ago. You'll see intense showdowns between armies of deadly war elephants, the strategy and logistics of managing an army before modern technology existed, and the daily lives of soldiers and ordinary people caught up in wars between kings. If you were to come back to that battlefield a couple of months later, you would see a very different sight. The landscape, scarred with the footprints of elephant, horse, and human, is slowly healing. You can still see scraps of wood, leather, and cloth littering the ground, but almost everything remotely valuable has been picked clean by poor soldiers or the local villagers. Most of the bodies have been cleared as well, but it'll take several more months for the corpses of the horses and elephants to be cleared away, first by the vultures and then burned in massive bonfires. The smell of death will linger on in this place for years to come. But near the village, under the shade of a peepal tree, you'll see a small group of locals crowded around a tall stone sculpture. This grey stone slab depicts a warrior figure in multiple panels. In one, he's praying to a god. In another, he's being welcomed into heaven by apsaras or heavenly nymphs. But the largest panel shows him riding a horse, bravely wielding his sword before a horde of enemy fighters. This is the young warrior from before, immortalized in carved stone, depicting his act of selfless valor. This sculpture is called a hero stone, Veeragallu in Kannada or Natukal in Tamil. They're created to memorialize great acts of bravery by warriors in battle, and they're believed to hold some kind of power or spirit within them. The locals assembled around this hero stone are decorating it with flower garlands, leaving plates of fruit and rice mixed with blood before it, and cooling the stone with fans made of peacock feathers. Hero stones would be richly carved and brightly painted, which will have faded in the archaeological remains we find in modern times. In the heavily militarized societies of medieval India, it was considered the duty of Kshatriyas to lead armies, engage in battle, and give their lives for their king and kingdom. Of course, Kshatriyas weren't the only ones engaging in warfare. It wasn't at all uncommon for Shudra and even Brahmin warriors to engage in combat and conquest, particularly in South India. But on a more personal level, the worth of an Indian warrior was measured by his military prowess, his acts of bravery, and the glory he brought to himself and his clan. You see, lineage played a very important role in the social and political hierarchies in the medieval times. While it may have been possible to rise up the ranks from a lowly soldier to a captain or commander, this would have been very rare. For the most part, a military aristocracy would have occupied any positions of power in the army, ensuring that high-ranking officers were almost always from a wealthy family from a long line of warriors. It also just made sense. Our young warrior, who was the son of a powerful commander, had received training in melee combat, riding horses and elephants, and military strategy from a very young age, giving him a distinct advantage when it came to leading armies. When the time came, he got a chance to ride alongside the king to prove his worth on the battlefield. In his last 2 battles, the young man had managed to impress the king, who rewarded him handsomely with land, a mansion with servants, and gold and jewels. But it had not been easy getting here. There would have been intense competition among the military elite families of the kingdom, all of their young sons vying for the attention and favor of the king. They would appear friendly and amicable in public, but would secretly be scheming behind each other's backs and trying to outperform one another on the battlefield. In that sense, these men weren't so different from the knights of medieval Europe. There was even a formal ceremony for honoring a warrior with a title. The king would tie a pattabanda around the head of a kneeling warrior. The pattabanda was a long strip of cloth with a metal plate at the center indicating the rank of the wearer. A high-ranked warlord could own acres and acres of land, earn a handsome rent from farmers, have his own emblem and flag, and marry a bride from a powerful family to further increase his status. But when it came time to wage war, it's not just the Kshatriya warriors, but people from all over the kingdom who would assemble under the king's banners. Before each campaign, the king would delegate the recruitment of soldiers to his vassal lords and chieftains, who would send out officers to towns and villages to procure able-bodied men for the army. These were the days before professional standing armies with soldiers who were paid a salary, so the majority of the infantry forces would comprise of laborers and farmers. I spoke about this with Anirudh Kanisetti, medieval Indian historian and author of the award-winning book Lords of the Deccan.
These guys were essentially small-time farmers, and what would happen is that when a boy came of age, if his father didn't have enough land to give him and for all of his brothers, then he'd just go off to war, So you can imagine that these guys, when they set off, went with other young men from their village. They would have gone with an older relative of theirs or a member of their caste who had the connections required to find them employment, where essentially you go to a market town and then you have recruiters there like, I need 10 guys who know how to do this, and this is your wage. And then you go and sign up with that guy. I think it's really as straightforward as that. It's not, oh yes, I am from this caste and therefore I must fight for this king from this place for honor and glory. It's more like, yeah, okay, you need somebody who can shoot 10 rifles. Here's my group of 10 guys. This is what we charge. Okay, deal.
These men would leave their homes wearing little more than a loincloth or a lungi and perhaps a turban. They take whatever weapons they had lying around at home, like an old spear or a wood-cutting axe. Since most of these men work on the fields and an army needs food to survive, war campaigns typically kicked off right after the October harvests. Summer would be too hot and dry, and the monsoon months would turn the landscape into slushy mud, making it impossible to march. The cooler winter months between November and January were ideal. Once these farmer-turned soldiers arrived at the war camp, they would behold a sight that we can scarcely imagine today, because a medieval Indian war camp is simultaneously intimidating and a thing of great beauty. An army encampment would be geometrically laid out, sort of like a medieval city. At its very center was where the king had his tent and personal guards. Around it were the camps of military nobles and the elite armies directly commanded by the king. The next layer consisted of petty officers, priests, the armory and kitchens. Outside that would be the main army camps, militia groups and untrained soldiers, stables of horses and elephants, tribal armies, mercenaries, courtesans to pleasure the wealthy officers, merchants and poets who'd come to observe and write epic songs about the king's exploits. There would be constant chattering activity wherever you looked. The king would be performing elaborate rituals and engaging astrologers to predict success for his campaign. Blacksmiths would be repairing armor and weapons, animal handlers would be feeding and preparing the beasts for battle, water carriers would be lugging big drums of water from the nearby river, and cooks would be distributing food to the soldiers and everyone else. To an extent, local villagers and farmers might have sold food grains and produce to the army camp, but in all likelihood, the king would have simply requisitioned food supplies from the land. This is why campaigning in the winter months was preferred. Right after the harvests, villages would have stored large quantities of rice, wheat, and millets, among other food items, ready for the army to appropriate. A war party passing through your local region was like a tank rolling through a meadow, flattening everything in its path. Forests would be cleared out, the ground would be churned and trampled by the feet of thousands of humans, horses, and elephants, and any readily available resources like firewood, berries and fruit, and wild game would be quickly snatched up by the insatiable wave of man and beast. In their wake, they'd leave behind a trail of waste, both human and animal. If you were a farmer whose land the war camp was passing through, there would be little you could do but to watch them leave and clean up after them. But moving this massive army across the landscape was no simple task. The king and his generals had to plan ahead, handle the logistics of managing so many disparate groups, keep the morale high, and survey the terrain so that they weren't going to get stuck in a place where they could be easily discovered or ambushed. They need to know the location and size of the enemy's army and would be sending out spies and scouts to gather intelligence. They'd have to decide how far to march each day based on weather and terrain, carefully managing food supplies, treat disease and injury among troops, and when quarrels inevitably broke out between militia groups or military nobles, the king would have to settle the dispute in such a way that both parties would be satisfied and one of them wouldn't just abandon the campaign. The logistics of war have always been the most underrated parts of military history because few people like to admit that wars are won not by great acts of valor but by resource management.
I think we tend to think of war as these very flashy, glamorous, like awesome affairs where swashbuckling, charging in on like these caparisoned steeds. But the fact is that through all of history, the guys who have won wars are the guys who focus on the most boring aspects of it, which is logistics and manpower. If you're able to deploy those effectively, you win. Like that's it. Like it doesn't matter how dashing your general is. You can be, Hannibal Barca. You're still not going to win a war if you don't have manpower, if you don't have command of logistics.
But ultimately, the goal of warfare is to defeat your enemy in a pitched battle, a final showdown where all that strategy, all that manpower would finally become useful. The night before the battle, the two armies would be encamped on either side of the battlefield and furious preparations would be underway. In the outer circles of the camp, soldiers would be sharpening their weapons, archers would be testing their bows and arrows one final time, and praying to the gods for protection. Animal handlers would be preparing the war elephants, attaching the howdah to the animals' backs, covering them with some kind of armor, and attaching deadly spikes to the elephants' tusks. As we move further in, there would be priests performing holy rituals to ensure the success of the king and his vassals, and armorers would be polishing chainmail and saddles for the rich lords and warriors. At the center of the camp would be the king and his closest entourage, perhaps sitting around a table and planning the next day's combat. Using the intelligence gathered by their spies and scouts, they'd be devising battle formations and strategies. How many men does the enemy have? How many animals? Does the terrain favor our army or theirs? All of these details would factor into how the battle would unfold the next day. Of course, there'd also be a political angle to this, where different warlords would be vying to position themselves and their sons so as to be most visible to their peers and the king himself, all in a bid to enhance their personal glory by killing the most enemy soldiers and damaging their defenses. On the day of the battle, much like in a game of chess, it was the pawns or the ordinary skirmishers who were standing at the front lines. Wearing little more than loincloths, hair oiled and tied up in a bun, these bare-chested warriors would hurl insults at each other, brandishing their spears and clubs to intimidate the other side. As the tension mounted, the soldiers growing more and more agitated, it was only a matter of time before the dam broke and both armies flooded onto the open field in a terrifying surge. While we don't have many descriptions of exactly how these battles unfolded, we can imagine the sights and sounds of combat. The screams of men slamming into each other, steel thrusting and slicing through flesh, blood soaking the mud of the battlefield. Medieval Indian battles would often last several days, with the armies clashing for hours at a time, then retreating to recover, then coming back the next day with renewed vigor. Archers were one of the most important wings of the army, trained to use bows made with wood, bamboo, and even animal bone or horn. They were highly respected owing to the famous characters from epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana who wielded the bow to deadly effect in battle. When the enemy got within range, they would fire off a devastating shower of arrows, impaling soldiers and horses alike. While poison arrows were condemned in Hindu religious texts, that didn't stop archers from smearing excrement and donkey urine on the arrowheads, ensuring that even if the unlucky victims survived being shot, the subsequent infection wouldn't take long to finish them off. But if you wanted to inflict lightning-fast attacks and encircle your enemy soldiers, there was nothing better than warriors on horseback, the cavalry. Over the course of the medieval era, Indian empires were growing increasingly dependent on well-armored, sword-wielding shock troops that rode into battle, slicing through foot soldiers and escaping before they could retaliate.
So if you look at the great temples of the Hoysalas in Karnataka, you will see these bands of cavalry beginning to appear on the plinths of the temples, because suddenly cavalry have emerged as, I think, the most important arm of the medieval state, because through the early medieval period, states operated on these networks of alliances, vassalship, fealty. So the king's authority was always a bit of an indirect thing, like sure, the king is supreme in his dominion, like in his capital and the areas around that, but like far away, like a vassal who's living like 400 kilometers from the king can defy the king. He doesn't have to like always send tribute. He can kind of do his own thing, because the king's army, which is men and elephants, will take forever to reach him. But what really changes in the 12th century is that you see a whole crop of new states. The Kakatiyas, the Hoysalas, the Pandyas. And what all of these states have in common is cavalry. Because if you're a vassal 400 kilometers away and the king has cavalry that he can send it to, you're going to think twice before defying him.
These horses, bred in the Middle East or Central Asia and purchased from Arab merchants at exorbitant prices, were the next evolution of warfare and administration. Wealthy warriors donning gleaming armor and chainmail would have led their elite corps of cavalry to shock the enemy formations, causing them to scatter, making it easier for archers to pick them off. But by far the most terrifying, awe-inspiring engines of the Indian war machine, faster than any foot soldiers and many times bigger than the biggest horse, were the unstoppable war elephants. These 5-ton behemoths, trained for bloodshed and driven by expert mahouts, were the battering rams of the army. Chalukya rulers were known to have fed elephants large quantities of alcohol before a battle, sending these beasts into a drunken frenzy as they trampled everything in their path. Archers and spearmen would have sat on their backs, releasing arrows and javelins into the press of men below. Imagine how terrifying it must have been to be trapped in the path of a charging bull elephant, its spiky tusks tossing soldiers 10 feet in the air. When two elephants clashed, the brutality of the exchange would be hard to describe. Of course, the infantry weren't defenseless against these large creatures. They carried tridents, lances, and spears, approaching the enemy from the side to cut into the animal's thick hide. For this reason, every war elephant would have been surrounded by a group of soldiers, ready to fight off anyone who tried to attack the elephant. The battlefield would have been carnage manifest. In the chaos of battle, where multiple militias and warrior groups fought on the same side, it would be utterly impossible for the king alone to keep track of everything. That's why each division of the army would be commanded by different warlords, the soldiers trained to respond to the sound of a specific trumpet or horn. They might have also carried unique banners to identify each other. You can imagine that, for example, the Lord of the Fish banner might recognize his age-old enemy, the Lord of the Peacock banner, and try to defeat him to win greater glory. Battles could sometimes last for multiple days, after which typically one side faced heavier casualties and was defeated. But the losing army wouldn't just regroup and fall back, they'd straight up be scattered to the wind.
In where you'll always see whenever European armies, at least in the first few decades, whenever they're in contact with Indian armies, they were so surprised that look, we just like defeated this guy and then his army just disappeared. But if that happened to a European army, they would like fall back, regroup, and then fight another day. The reason for that is because recruitment was not a uniform thing in India. People went to whoever was paying them best. Because you had your own caste networks, you had your networks of relatives and family that brought you to the battlefield to fight for such and such person. But those networks outlived the person who you were fighting for. If that guy was defeated, you had more important things to do. Your loyalty was to all these other things, not just to your king, to your state, to your bureaucracy. You had all these other things going for you.
For military nobles or a king, it was far better to be slain in battle than survive as a captive of the enemy. If they were killed in action, they were seen by their peers as a great hero and welcomed into heaven. If they were captured, on the other hand, the enemy would torture, humiliate, and parade them through the streets, forever destroying the name of their house. Even if they managed to escape, they'd have to live out the rest of their lives in shame. However, if the victorious king meant to conquer the land he attacked, he might instead show mercy to the defeated rulers. Not because he suddenly grew a conscience, but because the defeated kings could become his vassal rulers, swearing fealty to his throne. When the Rashtrakutas defeated a coalition of South Indian kings, they were forced to go to his camp and rub their crowns on the king's feet as a display of submission. So yes, there still was an element of humiliation there, but at least they got to keep most of their lands and power. Looking back at the great powers of medieval India today, it's important to remember that the image we often depict of honorable kings performing their God-given duty to benevolently rule their subjects is largely a figment of our collective imagination. Most of the surviving literature we have of those times is royal propaganda, inscriptions describing a king's victories, or poems praising his philanthropic activities. But we need to remember that these are real people, no different from those alive today. Just like modern politicians are corrupt, self-serving, and power-hungry, so too were the kings of yore. Every kingdom, all the way from Kashmir in the north to Tamil Nadu in the south, did their fair share of looting and pillaging. They didn't invade and conquer because of some divine edict to enrich the land. They were making calculated political decisions to enrich themselves. 1,000 years later, everything about the way we live, work, and socialize has completely changed. But in some ways, nothing really has. Thank you so much for joining me on this in-depth look at warfare in medieval India. A big thank you to Anirudh Kanisetti, historian and author of Lords of the Deccan, for agreeing to be part of this video and sharing his amazing insights on medieval Indian history. If you want to learn more about medieval Indian warfare and military history, check out his podcast Yuddha with Aditya Ramanathan. I'll leave a link in the description. What would you like to learn about next? Drop a comment below and get subscribed so you don't miss my next video. I'll see you there.